Welcome to the first MSCAC Talks of the academic year. The MSCAC Talks series is hosted by the Master of Science in Applied Computing program, a world-class graduate program that provides students, industry partners, and academics with a unique opportunity to explore the practical application and utility of cutting-edge research techniques and technologies in an industry environment. Through our speaker series, we aim to bring together a community of like-minded people, all interested in technology, to discuss exciting topics at the forefront of innovation. I am very excited to introduce today's speaker, Sam Ip. Sam is a member of the technology group at OSLA, a leader in Canadian business law. His talk today focuses on Canada's first proposed AI and Data Act and its implications not only for organizations, but also machine learning scientists, engineers, software developers, product managers, and others that play key roles in organizations that develop, use, or make available AI systems. This promises to be a very interesting talk. So over to you, Sam.
Well, first, I just want to say thank you for inviting me. I'm always excited to talk to you. I was an engineer. I am a licensed professional engineer. And if you were to ask me if I had to choose all over again without, say, an engineer, I probably would do that instead of practice. That's another story. If there's one goal for the next 30 minutes, 35 minutes that we have together, it's really two things. I want to talk to you about this very, very important bill. The bill is essentially for the industry. It's a law that hasn't come into effect. And the significance of this is for give you an awareness of that. But a law is often just that. The engineers, the practitioners, put in practice. If you can walk away here with understanding what this is about, how that fits into what your plan, what your dreams are to do, that would be success. So, two things I ask. I know this is a webinar, and I understand there are folks that are kind of listening online, and there are folks here, and so there might be a bit biased towards the students here. But I just ask if you have a question, if you have a remark. Some of you I've spoken to have worked before. Commentary. Raise your hand. Let's talk about it in the context of what we're talking about. It just makes things a little bit more interesting. So that's the one thing I ask of the audience here today. So really a couple of things. Back on context, I want to just align very quickly on the non-technical folks, some AI fundamentals, and let's dive right into it. And I want to talk with some practical. And so with that, let's talk about the background. It comes as no surprise that everywhere you go, you can throw a stone and you're going to touch AI to really just any chatbot. But I will tell you from the perspective of our law firm and the transactions that we see in the last 5 years, the amount of technology that involve AI deals, the acquisition of AI companies, licensing deals have just kind of hockey skyrocketed. These are kind of companies that use technology that you will or have developed, or organizations that have. But why should you care? I mean, you guys are in this program where Toronto is certainly, an epicenter in AI research. But a lot of AI laws, as we'll soon talk about, will kind of frame how you develop solutions, how you develop and implement it, and the guardrails you need to put in place to really protect the public. Some of you might come from engineering backgrounds who are professionals. There is a duty to protect the public. And so a lot of these laws that you start hearing about, a lot of it, that is the underlying premise, how to protect. In the case of C-27 Canadians, really, if you look around the AI laws around the world, it really is to protect individuals. So very quickly, just to give you context behind this kind of new bill. So, we talked about Bill C-27. It sounds like a number to a lot of it, but it is a proposed law. It has 3 parts. One of the parts is actually AI. What it does is it sets in place a framework that regulates the development of AI all of you have or will engage in kind of design or development of AI solutions. Before I delve into the details, there's some key features there. It talks about legal requirements about high impact systems. It introduces concepts that give the government authority to enact and penalize organizations. And there's significant penalties for non-compliance that are so significant that many of our clients, when we showed them and told them about this proposed law, they had reactions to it. I'll talk to you about this law, but one of the things that I would challenge you to think about is when we talk about it, to think about how you would react if you were an employer. Now, this has only been June 16th, and now it's September. We walked around and we talked to all of our clients who are data scientists, clients who are machine learning experts about this law, and we also gathered their reaction. What do you think that is? Let me just ask the question. Do you think that this new AI law, do you think industry will respond positively, negatively? What did you think? I see it, somebody there in the Columbia jacket. They were probably, okay, so we heard a response from the audience that says they probably would not like this law. Why? So the one of the response from the audience is that because it would put limitations on what they're currently doing. Does anyone else have another view? Over there. It's another great point. So another kind of another student said it's so that there's some certainty about what an organization can or cannot do. So it may be a mixed reaction. Is there anybody else who wants to chime in? So I'll tell you what the reaction generally is, and then we'll dive right into it. Our firm works with some of the largest AI companies in Canada. And so we took this proposed AI law to all of them. And the specific individuals we took it to are the chief technology officers, the leading ML scientists, really what I think are going to be you guys in the next 5-10 years. Almost uniformly, they said they don't like it. Almost uniformly, they said, this is a private sector, okay? They said that this has the potential, if it's not clearly rolled out, to stifle innovation. Now, there is other voices at the table. This is a very one basket kind of view. It's a one type of view. There are others, kind of nonprofits, that say this law doesn't go far enough, that this proposed law doesn't protect individual interests enough. But when we're talking about private sector tech companies, their views tend to be that this has the potential, if we are not careful, that this could stifle innovation. And we could talk about why that is. And let's just talk about some of the concepts there. Very quickly, before we dive into the law, just for those on the bridge who may not be technical in nature, when we talk about artificial intelligence, really in a nutshell, it's ways for computers to mimic human behavior. There's different ways to do that. Most of us in this room would generally understand it to mean machine learning. It's the ability for computers to learn from data. Many companies call themselves AI companies, but the reality is that only a subset are truly AI companies that actually employ machine learning. Different types of machine learning, and the concepts, if I were to put it on a map, would be this slide. Often there's initial input data, there's a machine learning model, and then there's an output. And so you could take stock price, you could take, detecting or interpreting a health diagram. If you're trying to predict a stock price, the input data would be what the ticker symbol is. The output would be what's the prediction of the stock price. And the model is to really just help you make that prediction. And so this is it in 30 seconds for those on the line. I know the audience here is principally technical, and so I won't go into this any more than this. But if you do have questions, please drop it in the chat. I say this because it will frame what we talk about. This diagram, although it's so high level for the engineers here, is really as high or low level as most policymakers and lawyers engage in. We won't go further than this, and we defer it to you. And so let's talk about this proposed bill. When we talk and think about bills, my goal here is to talk about to you when it applies and what the requirements are. And I'll simplify this bill for you guys. When we look at a bill, we think about the approach, what this law proposes in terms of approach. And the approach that it states is that it will take a risk-based approach. That's the stated view to regulating AI. And that it will regulate and it should be proportional to the amount of harm. Generally, most practitioners in your shoes would say that's a good thing because it means that the AI systems that make decisions that are the riskiest will demand correspondingly greater safeguards. And those that are less risky, not so. So this initial law actually just targets AI systems of the greatest risks, not all AI systems. I should mention that when we talk about AI in Canada, the reason that we're talking about these concepts and the reason this bill has come to light, it's in the backdrop of a global economy where many jurisdictions are thinking about how to regulate AI. One of the leading jurisdictions is the EU, and there's the proposed EU AI Act as well. And so Canada knows that, legislators know that. And so it's against this backdrop of many jurisdictions thinking about regulation that Canada itself has tabled this law. And so when we think about this law, one of the key questions is, when does it apply? When does the proposed AI Act actually apply? And so one of the key definitions that when you look into every AI law in the various jurisdictions, the first thing that most lawyers go to is the definition of what is actually an AI system. What are they calling an AI? In the Canadian AI Act, it's defined as a technology system that autonomously or partly autonomously processes data related to human activities, including through the use of genetic algorithms, neural networks, machine learning, or other techniques. And so this definition really talks about whether what you're doing falls under the law or not. And the implications often to practitioners is really this assessment. When you work for an organization that's contemplating whether they're subject to this law or not, the first question they will need help answering is what we're doing even in an AI system. And this definition is a little bit vague. What is a system is an interesting question. What if it's just a part of a system? Is that really a system? When do you, and what is the division between an autonomous or partly autonomous kind of system versus just a tool someone uses? Not very clear. Is there a processing of the data? And there's this catch-all where it says, it's either neural network, machine learning, or other technique. When does it rise to this definition of a technique? This question, just as you might have, is actually the first question most machine learning data scientists, CTOs, point out to us. They need to make an assessment. But the second question is, and someone pointed this out in the audience, that imposing kind of requirements on an organization without corresponding benefits could really deter an organization from wanting to comply with. And so often there are questions around, well, if this is the definition, how do we architect around it so that we're not caught by the definition? So these are the questions that are coming up when we talk about organizations. And so they look to kind of engineers to advise with this forthcoming law, how do we architect around it, or architect things in such a way that a subset of what we're designing is subject to this law. I guarantee you, if you take good notes, I guarantee you, these are questions that when you achieve some level of seniority, you're going to be very quickly participating in these discussions. So this is a scope question. It's a definition of AI system. If you don't fall under this definition, you're not caught. Then there's this concept of bias. I'm sure you talk about it in kind of your research and in your curriculum. there's a definition of biased output. These laws, these AI laws, are all about protecting individuals. And the proposed AI Act talks about a definition of biased input, which is an output generated by an AI system that's prejudicial in some way, with reference to the Canadian Human Rights Act. Again, the implications and what we often hear when we talk to clients' technical team is, what is an output? Because again, you need to understand what is caught and not caught. And very quickly, I think you're starting to see now, you have lawyers and policymakers crafting this, but it's really the technical people, the people in this room that have to really advise and implement this. And so what is an output? Is an intermediate output, which is common when you architect machine learning AI systems. Is that considered an output? I don't think that's the intent, because it's about an output that's prejudicial in some way relative to the Canadian Human Rights Act. But again, these things need to be informed by technical advice. And here's the last of the key terms. And key terms to lawyers is almost like the definitions of when you're coding, right? You define the variables and then you code. And so it's very important to understand the definition of the variables. And in here, that's the way that sometimes laws are drafted like this. And the third one is just high impact systems. We don't have a definition for it yet, but it will come up when policymakers come up with it. But there's this definition of regulated activity. Just because you have an AI system, it doesn't mean it's regulated. And it has to fall into one bucket. Either you process it or you design or make available it. And when lawyers read statements like this, it's hinting at what's to come. That is to say that the requirements of someone who's designing it will probably be a little bit different than the requirements of someone who's processing and making it available. And so 2 observations out of the gate. One is A and B is so broad that it covers almost everything. You could be working for an AI company that designs a natural language understanding solution. Well, you're definitely designing, developing, or making available. You could be working for a bank that just makes available a solution you've licensed. Well, you're still caught by A. And so it covers almost everything. So there's a breadth question to the point someone raised in the audience. But which branch you fall under will have different requirements. And there's always the question of assessment. But there's always a strategic question that us lawyers always engage in with the technical folks of how you architect around and try to fit under one of these baskets. But suffice to say, if you look at regulated activity, it's going to cover everything you guys will engage in. So those are the definitions. Now we get into what this law actually requires you to do. It requires a couple of things. It requires you to, first of all, make an assessment. Is what you're participating in something that's high risk? And so is there an AI system here that's high risk that could result in a biased output? This assessment is probably not going to be done by a lawyer. This probably will be done by a team that will involve some involvement from engineers. This is the first requirement. You have to assess. Now, one of the views from the organizations that we've spoken to, that's a basket of organizations we've spoken with that are kind of more in the startup emerging growth category. Their view is that if you are asking me to assess every week, every time I pivot a business model, every time I change the architecture of my solution, that's just not going to be a high priority for me if we're a 3-man shop in a basement. And so to the gentleman's point that raised the cumbersome of some of these requirements, that's one of the first pushback that we've heard. It might be practicable for someone the size of Google, but it won't always be practical for organizations that are kind of 2, 3, 4 persons strong. And so there's some concerns about that. The second requirement is once you made an assessment, you need to monitor the AI solution. I mean, it follows that if there's risks without monitoring processes and policies in place, you're not really going to be able to identify risks as they come up. Monitoring will need to be risk-based. And so we talked about how this act is really about proportionality and higher risk decisions merit higher risk kind of treatment. And so how you do that is a question that's, again, easy for a policymaker or lawyer to craft. But the execution, actually, and the resources that's required, that is something that needs to be carefully considered. So there's a couple of ways to monitor that we often talk about. And even in your internships, I understand you will probably, well, let me ask the question, have the audience members here, have you engaged in your internships yet, or are you returning back, or is it a mixture of both? So you're gonna start your internships. Okay, so it'll be very interesting for you to get involved in some of these questions. You can monitor in a number of ways. You could have feedback loops, you could have human interventions, you can have automated monitoring system. Usually there'll be some combination of the following. And then there's general requirements about record keeping, notification, and all that flows from kind of what you're doing. And often it is automated. Often there'll be a role for an engineer to automate the record keeping. So tie that with auto notice if something has gone wrong, if there's a risk that is inconsistent with a policy or control that you've established. One of the requirements of the new AI law is to be transparent. And this is actually one of the more common and often talked about requirements when it comes to the use of AI systems. How to kind of tell people what it is the AI system does, how it does it, how it makes the decision that it does, and how you've mitigated some of the risks. When it comes to, making decisions through, and we can counter this often, decisions through kind of the use of a deep neural network, it isn't actually always so easy to explain how some things actually work. And how to tell someone about it is also a different art in itself. And so, oftentimes when we work with clients and we work with engineers, some of the best engineers are able to articulate simply how decisions are made, what kind of risk can come out of that, and what kind of risk mitigation measures. One of the biggest challenges I still find when we engage with clients that develop AI solutions is when you try to explain how decisions are made through a neural network, the best explanations I've always heard are a mapping of inputs and outputs. The problem I often hear when I'm on the opposite side for a client is that the mapping of input and output isn't really meaningful, because to an individual off the street, that's not how they think about how decisions are made. They're hoping to understand a more kind of decision tree or more kind of deductive approach. And so there'll be challenges for engineers to help kind of that process, so how to explain to people and kind of how to mitigate the risks that kind of come out of that. Then there is the final piece about anonymized data. The AI Act does talk about use of anonymized data. And so what it says is that for organizations that carry out any of the regulated activities, so if it's a high risk AI system, they have to have measures about how data is anonymized and the use of anonymized data. Can anyone guess what the biggest problem is with use of anonymized data in practice? Feel free to kind of take a guess. I suspect many of you probably already do or will use data sets to some extent. So the biggest problem, and for those of you who are going to internships, I would say keep your eyes open for this. It's that what data scientists call anonymized data is not truly anonymized when it comes to the legal definition of anonymized. Under privacy laws, and certainly with Bill C-27 and the privacy reform, anonymized data is data that you just can't re-identify. Most of the time when we hear data scientists talk about anonymized data, they look at the data sets and they see if there's anything identifiable about it. Is there a name, address, is there a postal code? And if it doesn't have direct identifiers, most data scientists will sometimes call it anonymized data. But the law goes a little bit further than that. If there's possibility of using that data to link it with others, it is not anonymized data. So the biggest challenge we often see is actually that machine learning engineers, data scientists make use of data that actually isn't truly anonymized. And so the new proposed AI law will prescribe how data needs to be anonymized and measures with respect to the use of anonymized data. Someone mentioned earlier about how, some of these laws could create a burden for organizations. And when you look at some of these laws, depending on, the organizations you're going to be interning with or working with and for, it may not be so easy to comply with even requirements like this. You think of yourself as a 3 or 4 person startup or even a 12-person emerging growth company. You think about if you have to prescribe the way data is anonymized and you don't have that data, you have to get it from somebody else. You might not always have the leverage to be able to go out to them and say, I need it anonymized this way, because you're just not big enough to have that kind of bargaining power. In other cases, a lot of the data sets, where do you guys get your data sets from? Go ahead. What's that? So public data sets, Kaggle is one. Let's just use public data sets, for example. A lot of machine learning kind of specialists get their data sets online publicly. When you get it publicly, it's often a take it or leave it approach. You take it with the license that it has, or you leave it. You're not often in a position to negotiate. And so practitioners in your shoes have reacted to requirements like this by saying, look, maybe it isn't so easy to comply with, because what if I really want to use that Kaggle data set? But I can't, because the law tells me it has to be anonymized in a certain way, and I can't get it that certain way. So those are the concerns we're hearing when we talk with clients that are practicing this. Now, there's different ways to anonymize it. You can suppress the data, you can generalize it, you can add noise to it. There's the concept of differential privacy, where you can create, you can add enough noise to create a similar comparable data set. And while there are approaches, you may not be able to actualize those approaches. And that has been a concern. And so a couple of other comments, the implications now. So we talked about what the requirements are. Is it within scope? Is it AI system? If it is it regulated activity? What do you have to do? You need to assess, you need to monitor, you need to notify if they're harmed. And you need to let the individuals know what you're doing with the decisions and how these decisions are being made. Now we're on to what happens if you're non-compliant, or what are the implications if there's reason to believe you're not compliant? Well, the minister can require an audit, but they can also ask the organization to stop using the AI system. And so if you're thinking about it from the perspective of an organization, like, this is a very significant right. And this could have a serious impact on an organization's ability to do business. Think about, your bank or your financial institution, and the government is saying, well, you know what, the AI system you use to, approve or deny loans, we think there's an issue with it. We need you to stop using it. That could be a real problem. Now you need to revert and fall back to maybe a more manual process. But organizations have reacted to kind of the severe penalty. The audit is another one. It's interesting because audit means that someone can come in and look at how things are done. And for some of the most innovative organizations that you work for, some of your crown jewels will be the secret sauce of how you're doing things. And you don't always want someone poking at how you're doing things. And of course, in terms of penalties, there are criminal offenses. And it could be up to 3% of your global revenue or $10 million. This is very significant. When we talked about this law, it is 10 million global and not 10 million of your revenue in Canada. there's been kind of one view out there that it should be proportional to the revenue in Canada, since this is a law in Canada. There was a law before this called the Canadian Anti-Spam Law, where the same arguments were raised and was not met with much success. And so we don't expect this to be the case as well. But the implications of this significant fine is that for organizations that are at risk of this fine, somebody will need to be responsible for compliance. And that is the role for not just the technical practitioners, but of course, the technical practitioners. I want to talk about some practical considerations here. I won't go through all of them, but just really two key slides I want to talk about. There's the starting point for compliance with the AI regulation is really what you're doing in the context of what you're developing for the company. And when we think about AI, a lot of companies are drawing on really privacy principles, and a lot of them draw from privacy by design. So they call it ethics by design or AI ethics by design. Often think about it in terms of the processes to develop something. These are just kind of, you can map it to your own process. This is just one of any. Architecture is key in how you architect. What is the AI system and what is not will be a key kind of decision point in how you architect it. The greater the scope, whether you try to bundle the AI system into your whole solution or separate it out into microservices architecture will be important. Especially when it comes to a law like this, where the more isolated that you can point to and say that's the AI system and everything else is different microservices that interact with it, the more you can kind of limit or expand the scope of what the law applies to. I think that will be a key. Secure not just data, secure as in the safety of the decisions that are made to individuals, and supervising is the monitoring and transparency is the balance, but to map it to the process of development is often our advice. And then we talked about bias earlier with the proposed AI Act. The three common sources of bias we often see is really just, so first of all, I will say that most of our, especially our emerging clients, the issue of bias is usually an afterthought. But if we start making it more of a forethought, three common biases is really just designers unknowingly introducing their own bias into algorithms, the lack of complete data, and that even if the data was complete, it was prejudicial to some extent. So what's next here? We talked about the proposed AI Act. There's a few interesting kind of observations from the legal side. The AI Act was actually bundled into Bill C-27 along with privacy reform. And they bundled it as one of three parts. And so they bundled it together. It could have been a standalone bill, but there's a lot of pressure for the government to push through privacy reform and overhaul the privacy law. And what the government did is they tacked on the AI portion to kind of push it through. And so what the implications are to this is that although this is proposed law, there will be limits to how much it can change before it becomes law. It's already been tabled. The private sector response is that, look, the risk-based approach makes sense, but there are some good concerns about public privacy policy. The key concerns we're hearing, and I do want to caveat that while our clients are mostly private sector, there is another view that this law doesn't go far enough, right? Like if you're a nonprofit watching for the interests of Canadians, you will probably say this doesn't go far enough. But there are some general concerns from companies, AI companies, in that it is that there's a concern that if it's not rolled out properly, there'll be impact to innovation. That global companies will say, well, if I'm going to launch an AI product, then maybe not Canada first, or let's launch in bigger markets like the EU and then figure out Canada after. There are concerns about onerous requirements. And I will say that to this day, even the EU, which is a very large market, they themselves also has a proposed AI law, but it isn't yet a law. And so if there's a fragmentation, if Canada goes first and turns this AI proposed law into an actual law, and there's a discrepancy, it can be challenging when you're building products to comply with varying but different requirements. And so harmonization to some degree is good or can be good. There's some onerous requirements. Right now, the proposed bill doesn't really distinguish between obligations and responsibilities. And so I'll give you an example. We talked about transparency requirements about needing to explain how some things work, and accountability for how things work. And so some of our clients are those who are developing a natural language understanding solution. They will say, why is it my job to explain how things work? I'm just creating the engine. It's actually the person who's using it. And so if I'm selling it to a bank who's using it to field customer service calls, then it should be on the bank to explain how things work. It shouldn't be on me to tell and how to mitigate the risk. It should actually be my job to support the bank, to explain to the bank, or whoever it is that's the ultimate user. And so there's requirements, there's concerns about who's responsible and how to allocate those responsibilities. And then of course, the startup ecosystem is the source of so much innovation in the Canadian landscape. And the startup ecosystem is often those, 3, 4 or less people that are willing to kind of roll the dice and take a risk. And they don't always have the capacity to be able to comply with all of these things. And then of course, the criminal incentives. Still a proposed bill. It still needs to go before committee. And so going from committee, the committee will solicit views. And I think that there will be a role for the University of Toronto, even students, to be able to provide its feedback, especially practitioners who have done this before. It's easy for policymakers to say, you need to do this, you need to meet that requirement. But it's a very different thing for practitioners to say it's not so easy to do it. I am a startup, or I am someone who's dealt with these anonymization requirements, and what you're asking is actually far more expensive, or it's far more challenging, or it's impossible. There will be a public consultation, and there's various ways to get involved. The University of Toronto might be definitely suit the partners, and if you've got a view, definitely work with Professor Lee, and we'd be happy to kind of solicit those views. Your views are possibly some of the most important ones, as when this is a law, it will be the responsibility of amongst everyone, but also including engineers and practitioners to help comply with. And so there will be about 18 to 24 months we expect before this becomes a law. And when it does, there has been a suggestion that there will be a significant amount of time for organizations to be compliant. So just to summarize before we conclude, this is a big deal. This proposed bill is the first of its kind in Canada. It's worth understanding as legal practitioners because there will be a role for legal practitioners to comply with and advise. And it's just not possible for any organization to do it without the involvement of technical practitioners. I think probably why it's relevant to you specifically is that as an engineer, I think when you design these systems, you're going to have to keep these things in mind, these requirements in mind, kind of in the very same way architects have to keep in mind the parameters of which they build a house. You're going to have to keep in mind the parameters in which you design AI systems. And of course, there's always that overriding duty to really build systems that are safe for society. But lastly, I think it's such an exciting place to be, and I hope that you embrace this, because there are a lot of, these are requirements where there is no clear or set in stone solution. There's no map for kind of how to comply with this. And I'm looking at you guys here in person, and you guys are going to be out there, charting fresh paths, and there's no map for you to do this. And it's exciting, and it's new, and it's novel. And so
look forward to kind of the splash that you guys